Hi everyone, and welcome to this live edition of The Expert Factor. Those who are very perceptive would have noticed that we've actually done no episodes of the podcast for ages, for a variety of reasons. My crass disorganisation is one of the leading reasons, it has to be said, but it's been quite a busy time for all of us. But on the anniversary of the referendum, about a year from the anniversary of this government, and just before Lord Johnson here goes off to become very posh and grand at an Oxford college, we couldn't resist the temptation of getting together for a chat about what's been going on, what it means, and what might be happening in the future.
So we thought we would address some questions like, how has the first year of this government gone? Whatever happened to Brexit? Where are we in our relationship with the EU? How does the massive destabilisation we've seen in world politics going to affect the UK? And what is going on with the UK's economy? I'm Hannah White, Director of the Institute for Government.
You just read that out, didn't you? I'm Anand Menon, Director of UK in a Changing Europe.
And I'm Paul Johnson, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies for the next 2 weeks.
And this is the Expert Factor. So, Anand, I'm going to kick off with that question which fell somewhere in the middle there of my questions that we might address. And I should say, if you have questions in the audience, we're going to come to questions from you. We also have our excellent Slido, so if you're watching online, you can send in your questions online. Sorry if you're listening to the podcast after the effect, we won't be able to answer any questions you have at that stage. But kicking off now, Anand, tell us about Brexit. It's a year on, as you said.
Tell us about Brexit, Anand. Come on.
Make yourselves comfortable.
It's a year on for them. It's the anniversary of the referendum.
Yep.
We had our reset with the EU, this government. What does that amount to, in your view?
I think a normalisation is what I would say. We've gone past the stage where, I think, was it 3 years ago, where the Conservative Party couldn't figure out whether France was a friend or a foe. We've gone past that. We've normalised diplomatic relations. We're working very closely with European partners. At the same time, it looks as if, in economic terms at least, the deal that Boris Johnson signed is going to remain the framework of our economic relationship for the foreseeable future. I mean, the red lines on both sides means that's not going to change very much. So it's a friendlier, more cooperative relationship, but still, compared to membership, a pretty distant economic one.
And do you think we've got to where we could reasonably have got to at this point, or do you think the government could have taken a different approach or achieved anything differently, given where the EU is?
Well, I mean, there are several ways of answering that, I suppose. One is, I think, in retrospect, their decision to run the electoral campaign they ran, though some wrinkles over some of the promises they made on tax, I'm sure we'll talk about later on, but I thought it was made perfect sense not to major on EU relationships in the election campaign. And I think, to be honest, I can fully understand why Keir, Starmer and co don't see resetting the economic relationship as their overriding political priority at the moment, because there's so much else and there are so many domestic things they could and should be doing. Whether they're doing them, of course, again, is something we can talk about. So I think it's been, what you would have expected for them. The Labour Party does not want to engage in a grand national debate about Brexit. And in fact, and again, we can maybe talk about this, with the absence of scrutiny in Parliament of a lot of what's happening over Brexit, they seem to be going out of their way to avoid any conversation at all about it insofar as they can. Yeah,
I mean, that is something that's starting to cause a bit of unhappiness in Parliament, isn't it? I mean, one of the decisions this government took was to get rid of the European Scrutiny Committee. There has never been a good way for our Parliament to engage in thinking about whether trade deals are right for this country, because we don't get a say in our Parliament either in setting the terms of reference for the negotiations or meaningfully in signing them off. Do you see that becoming more of an issue, or is that just going to remain the sort of a concern of a smaller group of parliamentarians?
I mean, as a rule of thumb, what I'd say is anything that can lead to a joint initiative between Stella Creasy and Richard Tice is one to watch. And of course this did, because they are trying to flag the fact that government simply isn't being scrutinised enough when it comes to its European policy. And I'm sure this will continue as a theme during this Parliament, because of course, now that the summit has happened, there are all sorts of regulatory decisions and to be made about alignment if they sign an agreement on agriculture. This will require legislation. And so this whole question of who's scrutinising, where the oversight is, what government is doing and why, is going to become very, very topical again.
Moving seamlessly from what you know about to what you know about, Paul. In terms of the impact of Brexit on the economy, are we clear about where that has got to now? And do you think it's opened up opportunities that this government is proving able to exploit?
I don't think we'll ever have the final answer to the impact on the economy. I mean, it remains where it's been for a little while now. We know that there's been a dramatic fall in the number of firms that are actually trading with the European Union, because it's just become so much more expensive for small companies to do that. We know that bigger companies are continuing to trade, but they're spending quite a lot more in terms of the people having to employ to go through all of the additional bureaucracy. Broadly speaking, our trade overall hasn't kept up with that in similar countries. Has this had the 4% or so of national income impact on our economy that was forecast? It's probably getting on to that level, but could I prove that? No, I can't. I don't think anyone can show that. In terms of opportunities, it gave us government the opportunity to impose VAT on private schools, which I don't think they could have done were we still in the European Union. It's clearly meant separate negotiations with the Americans over their trade deals, and we seem to have done, or the Prime Minister seems to have done surprisingly well on that front, though the overall impact on the UK will be more created by the uncertainty in the world trading system and the sort of general worldwide uncertainty that all of that has created. And in terms of what you were just discussing, I mean, there is a real opportunity there to think about some of the regulations and how far or not we move from where we were. And neither party has made any real progress on that. I think it's one of the many examples of this government apparently being entirely unprepared for office, is that they've talked quite a lot about wanting to get growth, wanting to get regulatory change and so on, and yet haven't even started on the process of looking at how they might achieve that.
Can I just ask you a question? Before we come back to the unpreparedness, which I think is something we should dwell on for a moment, one of the really interesting things about post-Brexit trade has been services. Because we're a services economy. We signed a trade agreement with the European Union that said virtually nothing about services. You might have expected, therefore, that services would see a more severe impact than goods, and yet services trade has done well. Does that mean it's done well, but it would have done loads better had we still been in the European Union, or is there something else going on?
I don't know the answer to that. These counterfactuals are always very difficult. I mean, the thing about services trade is that it's quite difficult to monitor. It's not as straightforward to regulate as things that go as actual stuff that goes cross-border. But whilst we maintain the same standards for some of our services and qualifications, then that prevents the barriers being put in place. But there are risks there. I mean, it's gone, as you say, remarkably swimmingly so far, but it wouldn't be very difficult for the EU to start putting blocks on some of our services as and when they wanted to do so. If they got worried about the scale of our legal services or our financial services or our business services being sold into the EU, they could do things to make that harder. So at the moment, yes, it has gone well. And it's worth saying that all of the sort of ex-ante analysis of this was very focused on goods, because it is so difficult to analyse the potential impact on services. And of course, services are, as you say, is much the biggest part of our economy, and even bigger part of our trade, or certainly the export side of our trade.
Well, I mean, thank God Donald Trump hasn't noticed the services when he talks about trade balances, because
thank God for Donald Trump. Yes.
Yeah, that he hasn't noticed services trade when he talks about trade imbalances.
Absolutely.
But so, Hannah, just coming to this point about preparedness that Paul mentioned, would you concur with what he was hinting at, that there seems to be a lack of preparation for government on the part of this lot?
Well, definitely, I think that there has been surprise about some of the areas in which the government doesn't seem to have had policy ready to go. I mean, I think, the possibly sort of slightly unfair way to look at it would be to say, you've had 14 years, you should have all these things you want to put in place. In practice, the Labour Party has been through, shall we say, a journey over those 14 years, and there were some quite different approaches which different leaders would have taken to what the agenda would be of an incoming Labour government, shall we say. And in practice, I think that this set of Labour politicians only really sort of believed that they were going to come into government a couple of years out from the election, and at that point, when things started to go wrong for Boris Johnson, and at that point, most of the focus seems to have gone on campaigning. And this sense of sort of almost superstition amongst Labour politicians, memories of terrible elections past that they thought they were going to win and didn't, has meant that all their energies, I think, went into winning the election, and so surprisingly little into policy development. In fact, not just that they didn't have the time or the money to do it, but it was actively, in some ways, they chose not to do it because they were worried about differentiating their policy platform in a way that would make people decide against voting for them, when the main reason lots of people were starting to think of voting for them was that they didn't want to vote for the Conservative Party. So I think that the sort of surprise that has come through has been that people have said, they've set up all these reviews, they've set up all these sort of decision-making processes to think about what their policies should be now they're in government, and they contrast that with 1997, when Labour came in last time, with many more sort of policies ready to go. I mean, on the one hand, I would say I would much rather we had a review and thought about what a policy should be in an area than sort of just chuck an idea out there and go for it and hope for the best if you haven't done the thinking in advance. On the other hand, I think like any other government, this government will discover that you think you've got 5 years disappears very quickly, and knowing what you want to do early on is really important if you want to lay the groundwork and see change from what you're trying to do in time for the next election.
They also don't manifesto that says change on the cover.
Yeah.
Well,
they also don't seem to be prepared in terms of their personnel. I mean, they've been hiring into Number 10 and the Cabinet Office, and still are trying to find people to do particular roles. So my sense is, if you look at economic policy, I mean, part of the problem that they've got is they tied their hands in there, or sort of looked like they were tying their hands in their manifesto, completely ducked all of the sort of issues that we at the IFS were boring on about for months before the election, then try to sort of sell this idea that things are vastly worse than they ever imagined, which is exactly what we said. You can't do that. You can tell how bad they are. Then sort of horrify everybody by putting up national insurance contributions, which is a clear manifesto break, by the way, whatever they might say, and then take a risk in the budget in October by leaving almost no headroom against the fiscal rules. So they got that this issue is going to hang over them for ages. And unlike, for example, in 2010 or 2015, when the Conservatives went in with, they basically told the electorate they were going to, smack them, and the electorate said, that's fine, we understand there's a problem. And this government didn't. They kind of came in saying, well, actually, it'll all be okay. We'll just be, but we'll just do change. And then I think it's then much more difficult to sell the fact that change might be quite painful.
And actually, what's equally surprising is it strikes me they've got a really good opportunity to do that now. I mean, given what's going on in the world, given Trump and tariffs and what's happening in the Middle East and what's happening with defence spending, I just don't understand why they haven't stood up and said, look, we campaigned in a time of peace, we're governing in a time of war. A lot of the stuff we said then no longer applies. We're going to have to make some difficult choices. I mean, it seems to me that this is just a really good opportunity to do that.
The autumn budget is the opportunity to do that, isn't it? I think it'd be quite difficult for them to come, if we're talking about the sort of tax spend situation, it'd be difficult for them to do that outside of a standard fiscal event. So, it's possible that, that Rachel Reeves in October, November will stand up and say, I said I wouldn't increase income tax and national insurance. I'm not going to. I'm going to introduce a defence and security levy, which looks rather like the health and care levy the last government said they were going to introduce. Now, you could make the argument for that. I think it would be iffy, but you could make the argument for something like that. I don't think they could make the argument for we're going to bust our fiscal rules and we're going to borrow piles more, because this additional defence spending looks pretty permanent. It doesn't look like this is something we have to do for 5 years and then we can go back to where we were. If it's a permanent increase in spending, then it needs to be a permanent increase in revenue. And to get significant amounts, they need to do something like that. They could do something on income tax or employee national insurance, or they could they could do the sort of the better window dressing around something new that's allocated. People probably feel less happy about a defence levy than they would about a health levy, but that's the sort of thing you might consider doing if you're in their place. And I guess that is something, I don't know, but I would imagine that is the sort of conversation that they're having. Because if they don't do that, their risk is that they just stumble from fiscal event to fiscal event to fiscal event, where things gradually get worse and they have to scramble around for 10 billion this year and 10 billion next year and 10 billion the year after. And we just keep getting bad news about welfare cuts or tax rises. Now, it's a big... that'll be obviously another big tax rise in the autumn would be a huge political and economic gamble, and I guess they'll be taking. They're going to have to decide which end of that they end up on. I mean, what Rachel Reeves did last October was a big tax rise, but not big enough given her spending plans, and given that her rock solid, ironclad fiscal rules, no space at all against it at all. She took a punt. She took a punt that things would get better. They haven't. Is she just going to keep on taking that punt, or is she going to make some big, bold change so that they have then the next 3.5 years without having to worry so much about that?
And Paul mentioned the question about bringing people in. I wonder what you think about how the people who've come into government with Labour have managed that transition from being in opposition to being in government, the people whose jobs have changed from that very different role of opposition and now taking on those ministerial roles for which, it's there are some who have prior experience, but not many.
I mean, it's been very striking looking at this government, hasn't it? That a couple of people came in and were straight off the blocks and acting quite quickly. Ed Miliband, I think, comes across as an example. It's no surprise that he's one of the few who had senior governmental experience beforehand. I mean, just to reinforce the point you were making before, I was talking to a friend who's quite senior in the Labour Party about 4 or 5 months before the election, talking about policy, and their reaction to a question I asked them was, don't curse it, don't talk about government until... And this is a very Labour Party thing, which is kind of like, if you talk about governing before you're elected, you're going to curse it and we're going to lose the election. I think a lot of the people I still see have found it an absolute shock to the system. And actually, this is where the lack of a plan comes in, isn't it? Because you don't have time to reflect when you're in a senior governmental position. I think Paul's absolutely right. I think number 10 looks really undercooked. I was going to say they haven't replaced John Bew, but in a way they didn't need to, because it seems to me he's still doing his old job, but based at KCL now rather than based in number 10, because he's still writing the Strategic Defence Review for them. I think they're just hiring a senior economic advisor in number 10, which strikes me as
a year late.
A little bit strange. I mean, one of the things about this government that frustrates me is the sort of lack of direction. And I think, for me, the problem comes from the fact that the two key people in government are essentially technocrats. And they're very good at sort of analysing problems and thinking about solutions to specific problems. But in terms of laying out a vision of where the country should be going, or where you want to end up after your term in government, I think there's been a big hole. But actually, Paul, if I could just ask you on the back of what you've seen so far, do you have a clearer notion of where growth is meant to come from?
I mean, up to a point. I mean, in some ways, I think they've been quite impressive. I think the chancellors past, facing the situation they're facing, have cut rather than increased investment spending, for example. And that is a long-term thing, and I think it is to be applauded that governments are looking at things that do good in the long run. I've been quite impressed by their planning reforms. I mean, frankly, I think there is scope to go significantly further, but they are making movements in the right direction there. I've liked their at least some of their rhetoric about regulation, and I haven't had a chance to look at today's industrial strategy, but I've at least seen some people say some nice things about it. But I'm not really in a position to comment on that. So I think there are some things to applaud, and there is a sort of a beginning to set out a kind of strategy. You can tell there's a but at the end of this. The actions actually so far have not really been in line with that. I mean, they've talked a good game on deregulating. They've actually significantly additionally regulated in housing and employment and in other areas. So what do they actually think? Do you look at what they've done, or do you look at what they say they're going to do? They've obviously decided that the political thing to do was increase employer national insurance contributions, which is not the thing that you would do if you were really focused on growth. Unbelievably, they increased stamp duty. So I want to get into every one of our podcasts because I hate it so much, but it really is just staggering that you'd say that you're interested in growth and then increase the most growth-unfriendly tax that exists. So I think there's on regulation. I mean, if they're really serious about making differences here, and this goes back to what we were saying about about Europe and the regulations there, you would put someone really, really serious in charge of this and really look to drive through change across government. I see absolutely no sign of that happening anywhere. So you've got this gap between the rhetoric and what's actually happening, and then you've clearly got pressures from the Labour MPs who, as far as I can tell, want a more interventionist kind of regime, probably keener on regulation, keener on higher taxes, really don't seem to like these very limited efforts to reduce the rate of growth of the spending on disability benefits, and a government which now looks like it's willing to U-turn in the face of these pressures. And I think part of the problem with being willing to U-turn is, as you say, if you don't have a very clear sense of direction and a really clear narrative about what you're doing, then each individual thing looks U-turnable on because it's not part of a broader narrative.
So when we get the Johnson Commission on Regulation, you'll know where the idea came from. Shameless plug there. But Hannah, just continuing on this thing, because we've got a question in on Slido. What is the most positive thing that you've seen happen under this government? What is the thing that makes you feel most upbeat about it?
Well, I was going to come back on the point you were making about people, because yes, there's obviously been some misfires on people, but actually, but particularly I was reflecting on the early days of the government. There were some quite interesting and impressive people brought into government. We had James Timpson and Patrick Vallance put in the House of Lords in order to become ministers. We had Chris Stark come in from the Climate Change Committee to work for Ed Miliband, maybe linked to what you were saying before about Ed knowing what it takes to get stuff done in government, having been there before. And I was going to come back to you, but you might want to answer the same question. The bringing Jonathan Powell in to do foreign affairs as national security advisor in number 10 seems to have really borne fruit for them. So I actually think, although some of the people might have had, some of the people coming in might have had quite a rude shock and having to adapt to the pace, I think, of government and the difficulties of that. Actually, some of those appointments were quite interesting and have been quite positive.
I mean, the Powell one's interesting because on the one hand, I think he has started well on foreign policy. But whether that's down to Jonathan Powell or the fact that I suspect Keir Starmer is very good at being reactive, because that's not about the storytelling, is it? That's about here's a dilemma, how do we solve it? And he's proven himself to date at least, and God knows there are a lot more tests to come in international politics, not least balancing his position on the US with his position on the EU, but he's managed to do it quite nimbly to date. And I do think that's partly because he's more naturally a reactor than someone who is out there sort of telling the story. But you had this event last week about sort of standards in government. They've made an awful lot, didn't they, in opposition about not being grubby like the Tories, about reforming the system. And from the bits I saw of your event online last week, I got the impression you weren't 100% pleased with where they'd taken us to by now.
Well, I think, again, we were a bit surprised on the standards front because it was a thing that Labour had made a lot about in opposition, and arguably some members of the Conservative Party made that easier for them.
Discuss.
And, Labour had some things in their manifesto, Ethics and Integrity Commission. I mean, I don't think anyone's ever been quite sure what that's for. But some other things that, and certainly in the early days, when they were in opposition and the early days of being in government, they had Sue Gray there, whose whole career has been about ethics and standards. So why they didn't take the positive opportunity to make some of the changes which are well agreed across the sector about things around lobbying, about things around sort of ministerial declarations of interest, some of the firming up of the standards landscape, not necessarily an ethics and integrity commission, because as I say, it's not quite sure, it's not quite clear exactly what that would add as a proposal. But the symbolism of that being an important thing for the government, I think, was there. Why they didn't take some of those opportunities, I'm not sure. I mean, what has been welcome is that when there have been ethical issues with a couple of ministers, those have been resolved quickly and there have been consequences. And that is one of the most important things about ethics in public life, is that there should be, if you break a rule, there should be consequences. And that is one of the things that most undermined confidence, I think, in public standards before, that when a rule was broken, it sometimes looked as though you had to find a way that rule didn't actually apply to that person if they were your friend. So that, I think, is positive. They kept on Laurie Magnus, the advisor on the Prime Minister's advisor on ministerial interest, which meant that didn't politicise that role. He's continued to do that job. They gave him the power to launch his own investigations. That was good. But there just seem to be more things they could have done, and it's a bit surprising that they haven't taken those opportunities. You have skipped giving your own answer to this question about the positive things that you've seen.
I think the foreign policy, I would say, as I was saying, I think I've been pleasantly surprised. I mean, when Trump came in and started being all Trump, the scope for us to get trapped between our sort of closest security relationship and our closest economic relationship, and to make choices, was really scary. And I think he's handled that quite well. Though, as we've heard in some of the government rhetoric over Iran, it's going to be increasingly difficult, I think, to sort of pass some of these things going forward.
Has there been a cost to the amount of time that, I agree, it seems like Prime Minister is remarkably comfortable on that world stage, but also, and has been forced onto it by events. But also my recollection is it usually takes Prime Ministers, 2 or 3 years before they get bored of domestic politics and want to strut the world stage. One senses that he's been so taken up by that's provided less leadership from number 10 on the domestic agenda. Is that something that you observe or worry about?
It's not something that I've thought, because I just thought there wasn't that much leadership on the domestic agenda, because it struck me that this is a number 10 that basically said...
So not because he's...
No, I don't think so.
The foreign.
And Blair was quite quick on... I mean, Blair fought a couple of wars in the first couple of years. He was Sierra Leone and then into Kosovo quite quickly. So I don't think it's a distraction. No, I don't think you can say because of foreign policy... not least because they'd had 6 months before Trump came into power and some of these sort of really difficult choices. I mean, the one thing I would say is, one thing that absolutely fascinates me about the Brexit story is it is hard to imagine the world changing in a worse way for a country that had left the European Union than the world has, which is to say, if you're going to leave a continental-sized economy with whom you have quite a significant number of security ties as well. What you want is a world that's going to be peaceful and stable, where globalization and free trade are going to be the norm, so you can strike out on your own and become sort of, the trading sort of Britannia on the world stage. What we've had is growing insecurity, we've had globalization screeching to a halt, we've had the EU and the US becoming more protectionist, and the world, I think, makes Brexit Britain feel a lot lonelier than was necessarily going to be the case in 2016 because of that.
Or does it not mean that the EU has more incentive to want to pull us closer because we do have that military capacity?
I think that's one of the great misapprehensions on this side of the channel, that the EU are the demanders on security. I think successive British prime ministers and lots of British policymakers think, well, they'll make concessions to have us in the tent on foreign and security policy. If you talk to EU officials, they'll say, well, if the Brits want something on foreign and security policy, they have to give something in return. So there's no sense in the European Union that, you know, we're going to have to be nice to them to get them on side with this. They might be wrong, and I suspect in some ways they are. I think the idea that you're talking about building a European defence industrial base excluding the United Kingdom is frankly bonkers. But it is a position that the French seem to have adopted, that they want to sort of limit the degree to which non-members can participate. Just to come back, because there's a question here on the constitutional reform. The government seems to regard constitutional reform as a liberal elite distraction. Firstly, do you think there's an element of truth to that? And secondly, are you really that surprised that the government haven't made this sort of standards issue a priority? Because once you get into government, you can quite easily see why you'd get distracted and not focus on it, can't you?
Well, I think it's a classic of the sort of thing where in your preparation for government, you would be like, right, here are the 10 things we're going to do to really solidify this reputation. Yeah. And most of them are pretty simple, rule-based things. You don't have to, you know, they're about what you say, how you enforce the rules. You don't have to pass legislation. You would just do them. And that would be a quick win. So yes, there's been lots else going on, and John Major was here on this stage last week, and he said, you know, he could quite understand in the context of the standards context why some stuff hadn't happened yet, because there'd been a lot else going on. So he was giving them maybe more credit than I have. But I just think it would have been straightforward to do some of that stuff straight up. In terms of the wider constitutional agenda, is it a liberal elite distraction, I think was the phrase. I mean, I think, so they are getting on with getting rid of the hereditary peers from the House of Lords, which is, I guess, something they did plan in advance. It's a relatively simple piece of legislation. It's a technical thing you can do to address something that they've talked about again in opposition, as you know, problems with the legitimacy of the House of Lords. It's the most obvious bit of House of Lords reform to get on with. I guess the worry is that in doing that, they'll take the wind out of the sails for, you know, those people who would like to see more House of Lords reform. Doing that as a sort of specific thing on its own first means that you take the wind out of the sails for bigger scale reform. I think it's unlikely we'd see any more of that. And for the related reason to the answer to the whole question, which is, I do think in the sort of current context, the security context which we now have, but also the economic context in which the government came in, if they'd come in and they said, right, you know, our priorities are to get on with fixing the constitution, as opposed to our priorities to get on with fixing growth and changing the everyday experience of people in this country, that wouldn't have been a vote-winning strategy. So in the sense of a distraction, yes, I think a distraction from the things I think they really do need to do, and the foundations they do need to put in place to stand a chance of being able to tell a different story at the end of 5 years to the one they started with. And yes, for people who care, they'll get a tick in the box for getting rid of the hereditary peers. But I think if they'd embarked on many other constitutional priorities, people might have raised an eyebrow. On the other hand, the thing that they are doing, which I think is really good in a positive sense, is getting on with the English devolution process. A lot of continuity from what the last government was doing, but to continuing to push that development of strategic authorities, more mayors, completing the map. That is something that they did think about in opposition and are now putting into place, and I think that is a very positive thing.
Okay.
Was completing the map the priority? Should that have been the priority there, or should it have been to deepen the devolution in places like the West Midlands and Manchester and so on? I mean, how much impact is it going to have these mayoral authorities in the sort of rural areas and so on, as opposed to actually giving real power to Birmingham, Manchester, Tyneside,
West Yorkshire?
So I mean,
somewhere like that.
Yeah.
I think ideally you do both, and you're right. Their strategy that they've chosen is to prioritise completing the map. I think if you fundamentally think that there is a good argument for decentralisation, for empowering that regional tier of governance, of taking a set of decisions closer to a region and so on, then it would be incoherent to say, well, it doesn't matter for half the country. the ones who've got it can have more of it, and we'll try it out, we'll make it better. And they are doing that to an extent. They've got the integrated settlements for Manchester and West Midlands, and going to have those, we've had confirmed, I think, in the spending review for London. So some deepening. We certainly think the work we've done, they could go further in deepening, but we also think that if you think it's a good thing, yes, you should also tackle the much more difficult questions when you haven't got an obvious metropolitan centre of how you make this work in other bits of the country where you might have a number of towns within a region. People don't already think it's a good idea. You know, the places that already thought it was a good idea are the ones who've pressed ahead. And now this is a question about how to get the others to agree with, you know, there being benefits such that they want to push it ahead as well. But they're not being given much of a choice in some places.
It's interesting though, isn't it? Because one of the things that changed as a result of the referendum was that every single politician went on a lot about regional inequality. We had the just about managing segueing to levelling up. But that's kind of gone from government policy explicitly now, isn't it? I mean, the sort of targeting of regional inequality doesn't seem to be an explicit priority of this lot.
I'm sure they would disagree, but I have to say it's not. I mean, you're right in the sense that it's certainly not one of the priorities that one sees them talking about all of the time, which is, in a sense, itself surprising given the political situation where some of those areas seem to have turned very fast and very sharply against the government. And I guess I wanted to, ask the two of you a bit about what. I mean, we've been a bit grumpy about the government, but they're not that disastrous. They seem like, from our sort of perspective at least, they seem to be wrestling sensibly with some of the problems that they're facing. They're not anything like as chaotic as the last lot. They came in with, I know, only 33% or whatever of the vote, but a very, very big majority. Why has the electorate turned against them so dramatically, so quickly? What is your sense of that? And I suppose, following on from that, I assume it's not too late for them to recover, but what do they need to do?
I mean, I think that's a really good point, Paul. I think it's really easy for the likes of us who complained endlessly about things under previous governments to bank some of the stuff which Labour is doing differently and not give them credit for it. So I think, the fact that we essentially have the same set of ministers now running the government
as a year ago.
As a year ago, and as were sort of shadow ministers for quite a period before that, is fantastic for people being able to build up expertise, build up contacts, have continuity of thinking about policy and so on, and if you think about the extent of the churn of ministers under previous administrations, I mean, I think extremely large proportion, like at least over 50% of Conservative MPs by the end of the Conservative period of government had been a minister at some point. Huge churn in ministers. If you think about some of the ways in which Labour coming in have paid serious attention to sorts of things we care about here at the IFG, but some of the sort of processes around the spending review, not perfect by any means, but seriously thinking about how data is used, thinking about what we're going to do in between spending reviews in terms of looking thematically across departments. Some of these changes that we, wonks like us proposed as things which would make the process work better are things they've paid attention to and done. And it's really easy to say, to find things to criticise, as we always, will. But we shouldn't just bank some of that good stuff.
But the electorate doesn't seem very happy with that boring competence bit.
But part of that is the problem, isn't it? Is we're coming to the end of almost 20 years of very little in the way of growth or rises in median incomes. And, the electorate gives every sign of having reached the end of its tether. We have this ridiculous sort of situation now of a five-party system operating in a first-past-the-post electoral system. And so they're just, part of it is you've come into office on the tail end of this, and whilst everything that Hannah said is true, and whilst, yes, it's good that they're governing for the long term and they're putting in place things that are going to bear fruit for the next 7-8 years, I can't help there being a little bit of me that's going, But you've got to show you're going to do something before the next election, because actually the next election could be an absolute car crash. I mean, God knows, this could be the last time we see a majority of this size.
And how much are they panicking? Do you know? I mean, are they basically saying, look, we're a year in, we've got 4 years to go, let's not worry too much about this? Or are they going, oh my God, you know?
Oh God, no, I think they are panicking. Whether or not they're panicking about the right thing is an interesting question, isn't it? Because of course, this is always what happens with local elections, isn't it? You get a set of local elections that are partial, that are non-representative of the country as a whole. And this particular set of local elections, because of when they were last held and because of where they were held, the story was always going to be Conservatives are getting thrashed, Labour aren't doing very well, and oh my God, look at reform, right? I think by the time we have next year's local elections, when you have them in London and a lot of urban centres, where I suspect the Labour Party, if the polling now is to be believed, is going to be shedding votes to its left, to the Greens and to the Independents. You'll have a wholly different story after that. But I think it's always the case that people overinterpret election results. Whether their strategy for dealing with what they see as the problem makes sense as well, I think, is open to question. I mean, in May's issue tracker, so Ipsos do this monthly issues tracker, and May saw immigration back at the top. Okay, and it was quite obvious why it's back at the top, because the government's been talking a lot about immigration. Of course, Nigel Farage has been talking a lot about immigration. I don't think it's great for Labour that immigration tops that list. I don't think you win convincingly against Nigel Farage if the single most important issue for the British public is immigration. So I'm not sure they're going about it the right way, even if they've interpreted the challenge correctly, which I'm not convinced they have. Because I mean, it is a very, very difficult situation they find themselves in economically, but also politically, because if you look at the polling, Labour are losing votes everywhere. They're losing votes to the Greens and Independents, they're losing votes to, not to the Tories. Okay, so I suppose there's some comfort there. But, so it's very hard to define a political strategy that's going to keep you safe in those circumstances. There's a question here that I really didn't want to ask you, because I suspect we could be here till Christmas, but I suppose I will. Thank you, Anonymous, for this. If Paul was asked to review the tax system, God help us, anyone would like to pop out for another drink, do so now, what would be his priorities?
Oh, gosh, well, how long do you?
Happy birthday, Paul.
Well, let me start with a meta answer to that, which is I would actually suggest that we have some kind of policy. So the last government just stumbled from budget to budget with no strategy in terms of tax. So we had personal allowances going way up, then way down. We had a corporation tax going way down, way up. We had pension tax going round and round and round and round. And this government shows every sign of doing exactly the same thing. So you go into the last budget, oh gosh, we've got to raise some money, what are we going to do? Well, we'll think about pension taxation. Meanwhile, everyone who's got money in a pension goes, oh, we pay our money out of pension. So, big economic cost of no one knowing what they're doing. Then, oh, we'll do this on employer national insurance contributions. We'll go to the next budget, everyone's going to have exactly the same uncertainty, because we've got no clue. I've got no clue what their strategy is on anything. In taxation. And that in itself is really costly. So there's a meta point, is I'd just like them to have some sense of direction. In terms of the specifics.
But we've got the manifesto pledges.
Oh yeah, right.
But I mean,
they broke them immediately. I mean, the manifesto says very clearly we will not raise rates of national insurance contributions.
All right.
And if they do need, let's say 30 billion or 40 billion, which is plausible, I'm not saying it's the most likely, but if they do need that kind of amount at the next fiscal event to meet their fiscal rules, then they're going to have to do something on that. And they might do it by calling it a defence and security levy, but that is basically the same. Same thing. But if they keep to those pledges, then again, they have to look at things like pensions, tax. I'm not saying they should, but they have to look at where they can get significant amounts of money, and that's very, very disruptive when people are saving over a lifetime, and then they've got no idea where tax is going to go. So part of my answer is actually a really important part is just give people some sense of what they're doing. In terms of the other things that they need to sort out the taxation of housing. It looks like council tax is going to go up probably more over this Parliament than it has in the last 20 years or more. And indeed, the spending review numbers last couple of weeks ago were predicated on 5% a year rises for everybody. And indeed may well be more than that, given the local authority, local government finance paper that came out last week, which, about time will hopefully result in bigger than that increases in Westminster and Wandsworth and so on, which are, scandalous for all sorts of reasons. So you need to actually, if you're going to lean on council tax more, you need to make it more rational. You need to be reducing, not increasing, stamp duty. If you do want to raise significant additional money, the politically easy but bad way of doing it is to continue the freeze in allowances and threshold, but rationalising the income tax system. If you're not wanting to get re-elected, I would be raising money by increasing basic rates of income tax, but they probably do want to be re-elected. And again, getting pensioners to pay a little bit more in terms of a small levy on their occupational pensions to reflect the fact they never paid on the way in. But again, these things you can immediately tell are politically difficult. The sorts of things they're going to be pushed into are, I think, going to be both politically difficult and potentially damaging. So reducing tax relief on pension contributions would be one example. There are good ways of doing that, but there are bad ways of doing it as well. A lot of Labour backbenchers seem convinced they can get lots of money out of a wealth tax. My unhelpful answer to questions about that is you need to talk to a lawyer, not an economist, because this is actually, if you're talking about getting money on a wealth tax on, say, people with wealth over more than £10 million, then all of international experience is that that's really hard because these people can afford really expensive lawyers, however much you might want to do it. We should clearly be moving to some form of road pricing because we're going to lose 30 billion of petrol revenues over the next couple of decades. And again, a lot of these things are politically unpopular.
But when you say politically difficult, and we're going to come to you lot in a minute for questions, and actually, can the first question include the cricket score? That would be very helpful.
No wickets down at the end. Okay. Sorry, Anna.
All right, okay, that's very sad. You say it's politically difficult. They're very early in their term, and they've got a majority of 160 odd, right? And so, let's say you need to raise revenue to do A, B, or C, and assume that A, B, or C is something that might bring us all some benefit down the line. Isn't now the time to do that sort of
thing? Well, you'd think so. Though with this big majority, they still seem worried about minor changes to welfare, for example. This is where I actually do think they will be thinking very hard about a defence and security levy or a health and social care levy or something which doesn't break the letter of their manifesto pledges, could be sold as something new or a response to a different world, could raise significant amounts of money and gives them opportunity to raise it further into the future. I mean, one of the things they do need to be careful about is the impact of, I think a lot of the, again, political desire is to try and increase tax on non-doms and on people on high incomes and so on. It's very hard to know what the impact of the changes they're making to non-doms are, but there's so much anecdote that it does appear to be having an impact on it does have an impact on behaviour. There's very little scope to get lots more from corporation tax. Corporation tax is already at its highest, our highest receipts ever. Something that I would never have imagined 20 years ago, and we're getting far more from top earners than we've ever got before. So I think again, the political pressure there, I think, is probably contrary to what's possible. But it's partly why I was quite disappointed by the last budget. So lots of people are complaining, they waited too long to the budget. Everyone's speculating, well, that's good because it gives them a chance to really think about doing something big in the first budget, but they didn't. I mean, okay, they increased employer national insurance contributions, but they made nothing in the way of serious reform or nothing in the way of changing, doing a genuine once and for all change. I think they wasted that first opportunity. This next budget is clearly going to be their last opportunity to do anything really big.
I think the other point I just wanted to pick up in terms of, is this the moment for them to be doing the hard stuff in Parliament? And picking up on what Paul said about, the apparent difficulty of some of these welfare changes, I think it is relevant to think about the nature of their majority in Parliament, because we've got, vast numbers of completely new Labour MPs. We had more turnover in Parliament than ever. More than 50% of MPs across all parties are new. And that's a bit unpredictable, because actually we've got some precedents from the last Parliament of quite a lot of backbench activism, groups like starting with the ERG back in the Brexit days, but lots of other sort of groups which mobilised together to achieve certain policy aims, as an example to this cohort of backbenchers. We've got a set of Labour MPs who've got quite narrow majorities who are possibly thinking, well, these 5 years might be my only 5 years. What am I going to do with them? How am I going to maximise my chances of retaining my seat? Does that necessarily mean always being strictly loyal to this government? And then the flip side of what I said earlier about the good thing about not having had a reshuffle yet is that prospects for ministerial preferment look relatively limited. So that might add up to a set of backbenchers who are more willing to rebel. And although you'd have to have a big rebellion for the government to do something it wants to do, and I'd be surprised this early in a parliament that if that was something that the backbenchers wanted to do, I do think that it's understandable if they feel a bit uncertain about whether they're going to be able to get some of this stuff through.
Isn't all of that just another argument for doing it or having done it early?
Yes, well, arguably so, unless the first time you try to do it, you get massive pushback and a huge rebellion and people get a taste for it and then you find you can't get anything through.
But it is odd, isn't it, that we're having this conversation that almost sounds like it's getting a bit late in the day for them to do stuff now and they're not even a year in yet.
Yeah, no, that's the nature of sort of political conversation, isn't it? That everything always seems urgent. And I hope what's happening is that they are making these longer-term plans, that they do manage to turn things around a bit. I mean, is it worth also we're talking about the government, but is it worth talking also briefly about what on earth is happening to the Conservative Party? I mean, this is extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, nothing has happened like this since, I suppose, you'd say the 1920s, where you've got one of the major parties which appears to be collapsing in terms of its support and being replaced by another. Now, again, it's only 1 year in, and it's less than a year in for Kemi Badenoch. But how worried should they be?
Very worried. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because if you look at continental Europe, you see it happening to the centre-left quite a lot. Look at the French socialists. At one point, I think François Hollande was, as sitting president, was polling at about 7%. So the centre-left have been destroyed by a combination of the far right and the far left. But that sort of thing now seems to be happening to the Conservative Party, and yes, they should be very worried about it, because A, I think the consensus is that they're not cutting through with any of their messages. B, they took this rather bizarre decision to not do policy yet, which kind of makes you wonder what are they going to talk about then. And of course, they're up against the direct challenge of one of the most charismatic politicians we've got in the country at the moment, in Nigel Farage. And Reform have been very, very successful in taking votes from the Conservatives. And it's very hard to see. I mean, you don't know what's going to happen. I mean, you've always got to have this rider, haven't you, that, in theory at least, President Trump will have gone before we have another election. There's an awfully long way to go, and an awful lot can happen between now and then. One of which is that, Reform might implode, though, it's happened before to parties of the far right, it might happen to them. But at the moment, yes, the Conservatives really should be very worried because their performance is being dismal, they're not cutting through. She is behind Keir Starmer quite significantly on who would make the best Prime Minister. And so the picture isn't rosy. Let me just add one more thing to that, though, is if you want a crumb of comfort for the Labour Party at the moment, it is that Starmer is ahead of all his potential rivals when it comes to that question, who would make the best Prime Minister? So you might not think the government's doing very well, you might be fed up. There certainly is a sort of anti-politics mood in the air, as there has been across Europe for ages, that make people want to vote against rather than for. But on that key question, who could you imagine being Prime Minister and doing that job? Keir Starmer's comfortably ahead of everyone.
And maybe the role he's played in the international stage
that always helps.
Has helped that.
Yeah.
There's a question for us here, isn't there, that us and our organisations about how we engage with and challenge and hold to account reform and the Greens. I mean, I'm very aware that in the run-up to the last election, we did lots on Labour and Conservatives, a little bit on the Liberal Democrats, and very little on reform and the Greens. Frankly, to look at their manifestos from an IFS point of view and say these are completely mad, from a fiscal point of view. I mean, they were. I mean, both Greens and reform were looking at a policy. I mean, they didn't not add up in the sort of sense that Labour and Tory manifestos sometimes add up. They didn't add up to the tune of hundreds of billions, and so were essentially talking about absolute fantasy land, but got away with it in the press because they were seen as fringe parties who weren't really weren't really subject to the same critique that the main parties were. And it does seem to me that we collectively need to engage much more in looking really seriously at these policies, because whether us doing that will cut through, I don't know, but at the moment it remains the case they're getting pretty much of a free ride.
No, absolutely, but that's the danger of what I call none of the above politics, which is you're voting for a populist party because you're just so hacked off with the rest. And when you get to that point, actually, for many of their voters, it's not about whether it makes sense or not about whether it's going to work. It's just, I've had enough, give me something completely different. And then it becomes dangerous because no one's interested in having those conversations about whether the policies make sense. Sorry, did I cut you?
No, I was just going to say, I mean, this is where the good thing is that actually, I mean, Reform and Green both have 5 and 4 MPs respectively in Parliament. Reform has now won some councils, so there'll be an evidence base. If they do well in Wales next year, they may be in government in Wales. There'll be, ahead of the next general election, an opportunity to look at their policies and what they can actually do when they're running things. And if that is the question, do they have a coherent policy platform? Do their sums add up? There will be more of an evidence base than there was ahead of the previous election.
All right, I've left this far too late. We've got 4 minutes left. Well done. Are there any questions in the room?
Loads.
Okay, loads.
Excellent.
We can always go on slightly and then edit out some of our chat and have the more interesting questions.
Thank you. You have to apologise for my ignorance, I suppose, and being slightly reductive, but in my sort of pea-sized brain, you've kind of got you guys that sort of do sensible stuff and have sensible output, and on the other side you've got politics, or party politics, which is about selling and, I guess, reduction to sort of 3-word slogans and things like that. So I'm interested in your experience of interacting with that world, and I guess what can be done to get more of the sensible world into the world of selling the sensible, if that makes sense.
Do you want to do that?
Have a go. I mean, this is. What the IFG does is take whoever is in government and say, what are they trying to achieve, and how can we help them use the government machine, make the government machine work better to achieve those things they've said they want to achieve. So for us, the crucial thing is to what extent politicians, whether they're in government or in opposition, are interested in that question of how to do the things they're trying to do. Is it just about a slogan? One of the things we got really sort of frustrated with under some of the previous governments was, one day there'd be a policy thrown out, the next day there'd be a bill in Parliament, and the policy process clearly hadn't been thought through to, what are the pros and cons and the possible unforeseen consequences and so on, because it was mostly about signalling that they cared about X issue. And so us trying to come in and say, well, actually there seem to be some logical inconsistencies here, and if you did X and Y, you'd do it better. It wasn't really a conversation that they were there to be having, because that wasn't the point. So that can be quite frustrating. I think the good thing from our point of view is that, for us it's about helping politicians deliver. And this is the thing that politicians care about right now. It's about not being those politicians who say they'll do stuff and it doesn't happen, and then the public get more frustrated, and it undermines trust in their party, it undermines trust in the democratic system, and it doesn't necessarily help them get re-elected. What we are trying to do is primarily about saying, actually, if you do some of this stuff, it might look boring, might look technocratic, might cost you time that you don't think you've got because you've got to feed the media machine, but actually at the end of the day increases the chances of you being able to do the thing you've said, and that might give you a sort of political feedback loop. So that's how we think about it. You know, often can be frustrating, but actually if you can get politicians onto that page, and some of them, you know, lots of them to be fair, are there already, then those are the ones you can have the most productive conversations with.
What I would say, though, is that good politics does both, not either or. You know, really boring technocracy isn't good politics. It might make for good policy, but you need to have that storytelling, that ability to condense your message into a few catchy words. I mean, you know, you'd think of some weird clone of Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson. Right, actually don't, because but, you know, ideally, a really good political leader will be able to do both things. He'll tell you a story and actually have the serious ideas to make that story unfold at the same time. Which is asking a lot, it has to be said, given what Hannah was saying about the degree of scrutiny. You're in charge of the mic, so yeah.
I just wanted to raise the point about the Labour government maybe lacking some direction. Do you think they lacked this direction when they came in, or do you think they fell into that trap of being reactive to external events around them, and it was a gradual process?
Well, I mean, my sense, I have to say, is that they lacked it when they came in. If you look at their sort of economic policy, they got through the election with sort of what Rachel Reeves called securonomics. She was trying to build a narrative around that, but it really, I think, was just enough to get through the election and the interviews that she had to go through at that point. They were pretending that they wouldn't have to make the big, difficult fiscal decisions and trade-offs, and all the evidence was that they weren't ready for doing that. So I don't think they came in terribly well prepared. And then I think they've fallen into the trap that we've been discussing, which is, yes, they have got some good long-term ideas, and they've been putting some good long-term technocratic things in place, but that's been continually overtaken by the immediately reactive stuff, having to increase taxes, having to back down on fuel payments, and so on. So my sense is they didn't come in with a clear direction, and that's created some of the problems that they faced. And inevitably, when you're making these reactive decisions without the long-term sense of direction and narrative, it's hard to place those within a framework that is more acceptable.
No, I pretty much agree with that. I mean, it was a campaign about winning an election. It wasn't a campaign about setting their stall out for government. And you can't blame them for that. I mean, politicians want to win elections. It's what their careers and their whole sort of focus is about. But one of the problems with our politics at the moment is that the things you need to say to get elected might be things that make it far harder to govern once you are. And that's just a really, really difficult paradox to get out of.
Following on from Dr. White's earlier point about English devolution, I wanted to ask about this government's relationship with the devolved powers more generally. So, you know, on the anniversary of Brexit, it was a massive deal for all parts of the UK. This government promised a reset with the devolved powers. How do you think they're doing that? We've had the EU deal, which will hopefully have positive impact on Northern Ireland. But beyond that, how do you think that this government's working with Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland? And what's something they should be doing that they're not?
I mean, my sense is it's another bit of a missed opportunity. I think that they did the good things that incoming governments often do when they come in, you know, quickly getting out to meet the devolved governments, saying positive things about a reset of relationships. And you know, they set up this sort of Council of the Nations and Regions, which Anand may have a more up-to-date view on than me, but hasn't seemed to do anything very dramatic. What I have picked up is a bit of a sense of frustration from the devolved government of not being brought in as much as they had thought they were going to, even cited on some key things around sort of policy decisions or international engagements, things where they wouldn't necessarily expect to have a sort of determining say, but as sort of governing equals, they would like to be kept informed. And I think those things don't, again, take a lot, actually. They take, some phone calls, some briefing, demonstrating that you mean what you say when you say, actually, we want to reset relationships. And I think more could have been done from the noises off that we've started to hear.
Yeah, I'd pretty much agree with that. I mean, they've changed the tone from under the Conservatives. That had improved a bit under Rishi Sunak anyway. But I detect on the part of the Scots in particular a degree of frustration with government in London at not doing more and not taking the devolves with them more. Now, there are going to be limits, there are going to be tensions. I mean, one of the things I'm really looking forward to is watching the tensions blow up between Labour mayors and a Labour Prime Minister, because that will happen over time. But I think this government, could have made more of an effort to include the devolves in policy making up to now than they have. But I think it's an improvement on where we were 3 or 4 years ago, without a shadow of a doubt. Jill's waving, that's a bad sign.
Resisting the temptation to shout. Could I ask an open question about Treasury orthodoxy? It seems to me that that's something that people learn about only after a period of time in government. And I can't think of a better panel than this one to talk about that. It seems to me that some of the old habits are alive and well. No, you can't hypothecate anything. No, you've got to prepare a business case that resolves itself in 5 years, etc. And I wonder whether there's any sense within the government that this is something up with which they wish they didn't have to put, and whether there's any appetite for pushing back on all of this.
I mean, they've changed some of the GVA rules around investments, haven't they? Which strikes me as a good thing.
Yeah, so where to start on that? I mean, the first answer to that is the Treasury is a creature of the Chancellor, and if the Chancellor wants to do something, the Chancellor can do something. So the last government, for example, did put in a hypothecated health and social care levy. It's entirely in the gift of this one to do so, and it may actually be the least worst of the things that they could do if they really need to raise additional money. Treasury orthodoxy changes with the Chancellor. I mean, George Osborne was a very different Chancellor to Gordon Brown. I mean, there were different circumstances, but the Treasury follows, to a large extent, the lead. I think that's really important. Secondly, orthodoxy is orthodoxy for a reason. I mean, when you try and do a Liz Truss, you see why. Orthodoxy is another way, in some sense, of describing what we've learned over a very long period of time and across the world about what is and isn't dangerous. Now, that's not to say that all of that is always correct by, and you can't push where you're going by any means. And to some extent, I mean, we have seen I thought a slightly iffy change to what we mean by debt. And so that, Rachel Reeves came in saying she would follow the last government's rules on debt, and then the Treasury happily changed what it means by debt so that they could borrow more, and actually they seem to have got away with that. I mean, that may mean we're paying a bit more on debt interest than we otherwise would. I don't know, but they've certainly pushed that out. I wrote my column in the Times today, actually, is saying I'm actually a little bit worried about the way they're changing their methodology for doing benefit cost analyses, which essentially gives them a lot more, in my view, it looks like it's going to give them a lot more latitude to impose sort of political preferences on supposedly objective economic cost-benefit analysis. So I think there's quite a lot of change in that sense. If you're looking at the sort of fiscal rules, I mean, the government is very hemmed in by its fiscal rules, but those are rules that it put in the first place, and they are very, very loose rules relative to what they might be. These are not sort of super tight rules, and if they break them by 5 billion, does that make any difference in reality? Not really. If they continually were to borrow more than that, we would have debt rising, ever upwards in a normal situation. That would start to cause problems on the debt markets. And you talk to people in the city, and they are quite clear that if there was a substantive and continued break in those rules, that they would start to get really quite concerned. So. Yeah, I think part of the answer is it's up to the Chancellor. She can push them in direction. Second part of the answer is there's a reason for this orthodoxy. And the third is they just are hemmed in by economic reality. It's also worth saying, they have done, as I said, they have genuinely put a lot of money into long-term investment within those rules.
I was just going to pick up on that. I mean, I think you're absolutely right about sort of only really seeing the reality of the role that the Treasury plays within the system once you get into the system. I was just sitting here thinking that if you'd told me a year ago that I'd be sitting here on this stage a year into the new government, and we would have spoken for an hour and 9 minutes and not mentioned the word missions, I would have been quite surprised. And I think that the relative weakness of missions as a way of driving and changing the way that we've seen government done is something that's been, surprising to us. We were sort of gearing up for thinking this is going to be a very interesting innovation in how you do government. And I think part of the reason I say this is because if you look at the spending review, yes, the missions have been a bit of a guiding principle to where you're going to spend money, but they've not changed the way in which government works. And part of that is because the Treasury is such a strong force in driving how government works. And one of the things we did before the election was our Centre Commission on how Treasury Number 10 and the Cabinet Office work together. And one of the things we observed in the course of that is that our centre of government is relatively weak when it comes to strategy. And if you have an absence of strategy, it gets filled by decision-making in the Treasury. And I think that is, exactly what we've seen. And in some ways, we said this, but it's only by coming into Number 10, coming into the centre and experiencing the machine as you try to use it, that you really understand the reality of what a weak strategic centre, a Number 10 which prides itself on its ability to mould itself to whichever Prime Minister comes in, while you have a Treasury which is actually very, yes, willing, as Paul says, to follow the lead of whoever is Chancellor, but also, is a really strong institution with ways of doing things. And that contrast with Number 10 means that the dynamic in the centre, and if you don't have, a strong source of independent economic advice in Number 10, makes it very hard to drive that strategy separate to those economic decisions.
I think we've pretty much... Oh, sorry, go on.
Hopefully this is a quick question, but sorry if I keep you guys too long.
That's right.
You guys mentioned polling in parties. Do you think the two-party system is dead? And if so, how will it change the way government works in future when you have coalition governments of multiple parties or really bad minority governments with no majority at all?
I mean, people were saying the two-party system was dead in 2015. And in a way, this election is a sort of continuation of the trend that brought us to 2015. So you can never say never. I mean, we had that combination of Corbyn and Brexit that reasserted the two-party system after then. The two-party system now looks very, very weak, absent events like that. I mean, and what does that mean? I think if you have a system of fragmentation that leads to coalitions or minority governments under first past the post, I think it'll be a nightmare, because the expectation is normal service will reassert itself, so we shouldn't burn capital being too nice to potential partners. I think at that point you have to start, if you really think that the two-party system is on its last legs and that this system won't deliver it anymore, you have to think about electoral reform, because that changes the incentives, doesn't it? If you know you've got a system that's going to push you to having to work with other parties, then you reconcile yourself to that. The problem with our system at the moment is if it gives you a minority government, you think, well, it's just for one parliament, and what we have to do is fight them at some point so we can win the next election. So the logic at the moment, I think, is pushing us towards electoral reform. The problem, as always, is getting a government that's been elected under this system to change it. And I'm just not convinced we're going to get that. So in a way, we're stuck with the worst of all worlds, I think. Yeah.
And I would just say, some of the strongest arguments which were made for first past the post system were, about stability and the government able to sort of push through an agenda and so on, have been sort of disproven in recent years. And I think, as well as the political parties sort of having to believe that this is a possible future that they need to think about the reality of. I think that the governing system needs to think about the possibility of an ongoing multi-party system. Parliament needs to think about its rules and how which really are set up for a binary set of politics, and really start to look quite unfair for minor parties. The Lib Dems have got 2/3 as many MPs as the Conservative Party, but far fewer opportunities to speak and so on in the House and to hold roles and so on. Yes, we've had a substantial third party for a while, but we've now got a much more diverse set of MPs sitting in Parliament, and I think continuing to think, as you say, this is an aberration, we'll be back to normal service, and not doing the hard work of thinking through, well, what would it mean if this was forever now, I think is a mistake.
And the other thing, of course, the other thing, of course, is you could get MPs being elected on 28% of the vote or something.
I have to say, I think this really worries me, actually, because I think the result of the next election could be basically pretty random based. It's pretty much a five-party system. And there was a by-election somewhere recently, wasn't there, where I can't remember, I think maybe one party or another won again. There was a clear majority for the right or the left, and the other one won because of the split in the vote. Labour got a huge majority with 33% of the vote. I mean, if reforms stay where they are, they could move to a huge number of seats, or very few, depending on it moving a little bit. I mean, as we've seen in Scotland, as the SNP have come up and down. And then you begin to really lose, both lose any stability, but also lose faith in this being a properly democratic system. So it genuinely, I think, is a matter of considerable concern. Now, the other outcome, of course, might be that Reform simply replaces the Conservatives. So we have one sort of, another election, Reform does well, Conservatives are eviscerated, maybe the Greens, stick where they are, and we move to a different sort of two and a half party system. But that's, I think it is quite concerning that we have this pure first past the post with five competitive parties.
I agree.
I'm realising that the difficulty
and
is...
more in the devolved administrations.
Realising the difficulty is we never agreed between ourselves how we would end this podcast. Perhaps that's a sign that we didn't think we
Perhaps
wanted
we shouldn't
to.
stop.
Keep going forever. Well, shall we just say, is it time for a drink now?
I think it probably
I think
is.
it might be.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.